people being quite remarkable and wonderful people in the National Health Service and all the other key.
At 6:47 a.m. on December 3rd, Buckingham Palace released a statement so unprecedented that even veteran royal correspondents had to read it 3 times to believe what they were seeing. His Majesty has determined that continued public commentary inconsistent with institutional accuracy requires formal response. Effective immediately, certain provisions and courtesies previously extended are being withdrawn. The language was careful, legal, almost sterile, but the implication detonated across every platform within minutes. King Charles had taken direct action against Meghan Markle, not through anonymous briefings or palace sources speaking off the record, but through formal, documented, irreversible measures that would fundamentally alter the Sussex position and ignite the most consequential royal crisis in decades. The action unveiled. The statement that landed in journalists' inboxes at 6:47 a.m. GMT was unlike anything Buckingham Palace had issued in living memory. Royal communications are typically cushioned with diplomatic language, carefully worded to avoid direct confrontation, designed to maintain the fiction that everyone is acting reasonably and in good faith. But this statement carried a different quality. It was formal, precise, and unmistakably final. His Majesty the King has reviewed public statements and commercial activities undertaken by the Duke and Duchess of Sussex over recent months. While respecting their right to pursue independent lives, certain patterns of public commentary have emerged that are inconsistent with documented facts and institutional records. After extensive consultation with senior advisors and legal counsel, His Majesty has determined that continued association between these activities and the royal household creates untenable complications. Effective immediately, the following measures are being implemented. What followed was a list that made seasoned royal reporters sit up straighter in their chairs. The Sussexes would no longer be permitted to use His or Her Royal Highness styling in any commercial or public capacity. Any existing agreements allowing use of royal connection for business ventures would be formally reviewed and likely terminated. Access to certain royal residences previously maintained as courtesy would be discontinued. And most significantly, the palace was establishing a formal correction process whereby public statements from the Sussexes that contradicted documented palace records would be officially rebutted. The last point was the nuclear option. For years, the palace's approach to Sussex claims had been silence, allowing statements to go unchallenged rather than engaging in public disputes. But this new policy meant that if Meghan or Harry made claims about their treatment, about conversations that occurred, about support they'd requested or been denied, the palace would now actively dispute those claims with documentation. It was institutional warfare, dressed in legal language. Inside Kensington Palace, William had been awake when the statement went live. He'd been part of the discussions that led to this moment, and had in fact been one of the strongest advocates for firm action. When his private secretary confirmed the statement had been released, William's response was measured but resolute. This was necessary, long overdue actually. The institution cannot function when former members actively undermine it while simultaneously profiting from association with it. Catherine, reviewing the statement in her study, felt a complicated mixture of relief and apprehension. She'd watched Meghan's public behavior evolve over the years, watched interviews that seemed designed to maximize sympathy while minimizing accountability, watched commercial ventures that leveraged royal connection while claiming victimhood. The action Charles had taken felt justified, but Catherine also understood it would ignite a firestorm that would consume months, possibly years of their lives. Princess Anne's reaction was characteristically blunt when reached by palace staff for comment. "About time," she said simply. "The monarchy survives through discipline and boundaries. When those are violated repeatedly without consequence, the institution becomes meaningless." Anne had been pushing for action against the Sussexes for months, frustrated by what she viewed as Charles's excessive patience and William's strategic caution. At Clarence House, King Charles sat alone in his private study after the statement went live, feeling older than his 75 years. He'd spent weeks agonizing over this decision, torn between his role as father and his responsibilities as monarch. Every attempt at private resolution had failed. Every boundary he'd tried to establish had been publicly violated, and the most recent incident, the one that had finally forced his hand, had left him no choice but to act. Camilla, who'd been Charles's closest counsel through this entire process, understood the weight he was carrying. During a private conversation the night before the statement was issued, she'd told him directly, "You've exhausted every alternative. You've been more patient than most would have been. But patience without limits isn't virtue, it's enablement. And you cannot enable behavior that damages the institution you're sworn to protect." The international reaction was instantaneous and predictably divided. British media, particularly outlets that had long been critical of the Sussexes, framed the action as overdue accountability. The Telegraph ran a headline reading, "King acts to protect institutional integrity." The Times published analysis suggesting this marked a fundamental shift in how the monarchy would handle dissent from former senior members. American coverage was sharper, more critical. CNN ran breaking news banners describing it as "Palace moves against Meghan and Harry." MSNBC panels assembled quickly, with commentators describing the action as an unprecedented attack on a couple who'd already been driven from Britain. The racial dynamics were immediately centered, with multiple outlets questioning whether a white duchess would have faced such severe consequences. But what made this different from previous Sussex controversies was the formality of the action. This wasn't anonymous palace sources briefing against them. This wasn't tabloid speculation or royal experts offering opinions. This was the king, through official channels, taking documented measures that would have real, tangible consequences for the Sussexes' ability to operate commercially and publicly. In Montecito, the response was chaos. Harry, according to sources close to the couple, was on the phone within minutes of seeing the statement, calling his legal team, calling contacts in London, trying to understand the full scope of what had just happened. Meghan, those same sources reported, was in a state of shock. She'd anticipated pushback, certainly, had expected the palace might issue statements disagreeing with her characterizations. But this, formal action withdrawing provisions and establishing correction protocols, felt like warfare. The Sussex communications team scrambled to craft a response, but the challenge was significant. Responding too aggressively would seem to validate the palace's concerns about their public behavior. Responding too weakly would look like acceptance of the measures, and any response would need to navigate the reality that the king had acted through proper legal channels with documentation in ways that would be very difficult to challenge successfully. By mid-morning, the story had consumed global news cycles entirely. Royal correspondents were describing it as the most significant confrontation between reigning monarch and family members since the abdication crisis of 1936. Constitutional experts were analyzing the legal precedents, and PR professionals were dissecting what this meant for the Sussex brand, which had been built largely on the foundation of their royal connection, however contested. The action King Charles had taken wasn't just about correcting public statements or withdrawing courtesies. It was a declaration that the institution had limits, that patience had boundaries, and that even family members could be held accountable when their behavior threatened the monarchy's stability and credibility. The question now was how the Sussexes would respond, and whether this marked the beginning of even more bitter conflict or the eventual resolution through mutual exhaustion. The pattern that forced his hand. To understand what drove King Charles to take such unprecedented action, we must trace back through months of escalating behavior that had pushed the palace from uncomfortable tolerance to active intervention. Because this wasn't about a single incident or one controversial statement. This was about a pattern that had become, in the palace's assessment, systematically damaging to the institution. The pattern had begun subtly in early 2025, as Meghan and Harry's media project started gaining traction after years of development. Their Netflix documentary series, released in late 2023, had been controversial, but ultimately manageable from the palace's perspective. It presented their version of events, certainly, but it was framed as personal narrative rather than institutional critique. The palace had maintained its traditional silence, and the controversy had eventually faded. But throughout 2025, the nature of Meghan's public statements began shifting. She started making claims that went beyond personal experience into assertions about palace operations, royal protocols, and specific incidents that contradicted documented records. During an interview in March, she described being denied security support during her pregnancy, framing it as institutional cruelty. Palace records showed she'd been offered standard security appropriate to her status but had declined it because it came with restrictions on personal travel she found unacceptable. In May, Meghan had given another interview discussing financial cutoffs, claiming the palace had left them without support immediately after their departure. Treasury records showed the Sussexes had received substantial transitional funding through 2021, far beyond what was required or typical. When these discrepancies were noted by journalists, Meghan's team would claim she was speaking about emotional rather than financial support, shifting the narrative whenever challenged. The commercial ventures created additional complications. Meghan had launched a lifestyle brand in spring 2025 that, while not explicitly using royal titles, traded heavily on her royal connection. The branding included subtle references to her time in Britain, photographs from her royal era, and marketing language that emphasized her unique perspective from inside the world's most famous institution. Legally, it was carefully constructed to avoid direct violations. Practically, it was clear exploitation of royal association, while simultaneously claiming victimhood from that same institution. King Charles had initially tried to address these concerns privately. In April, he'd sent a personal letter to Harry, carefully worded but direct in its message. "Your mother's public statements are creating complications that affect the institution's credibility. I understand you both feel wronged, but there must be boundaries between personal narrative and claims that contradict documented facts." Harry's response, according to those who saw it, had been defensive and dismissive. He insisted Meghan was simply telling her truth, that the palace's documented facts were themselves constructions designed to protect the institution at the expense of individuals. Charles had tried again in June, this time through more formal channels. His private secretary contacted Sussex representatives with a proposal. The palace would agree not to challenge or rebut Sussex public statements if the Sussexes would agree to submit any claims about specific palace actions or decisions for fact-checking before publication. It was a reasonable compromise, designed to prevent public disputes while respecting everyone's right to share their experiences. The Sussexes rejected it outright. They would not, their team stated, submit to palace censorship of their truth-telling. Throughout this period, Camilla had been urging Charles toward firmer boundaries. She'd watched the pattern with growing alarm, recognizing in Meghan's behavior a sophisticated understanding of media manipulation that the palace's traditional approaches couldn't counter. During a July conversation, she'd told Charles bluntly, "She's not going to stop because you ask nicely. She's going to stop when there are consequences that affect her commercially. Until then, every statement goes unchallenged, and her version becomes the accepted narrative." William had been more strategic in his analysis. He'd commissioned his own team to track Sussex public statements, cross-referencing them against palace records and documented timelines. The report they produced in August was damning. Of 47 specific claims Meghan had made in various interviews and public appearances, 32 contradicted documented evidence, 11 were impossible to verify either way, and only 4 aligned with palace records. William had presented this analysis to Charles during a tense August meeting, arguing that the pattern wasn't accidental or emotional. It was systematic distortion designed to build sympathy while evading accountability. But what finally forced Charles's hand was an incident in late November that crossed a line even he couldn't ignore. Meghan had given an interview to a major American magazine in which she claimed that palace officials had actively prevented her from seeking mental health treatment during her pregnancy, describing it as institutional cruelty that had pushed her toward suicidal ideation. The claim was emotionally powerful, generating immediate sympathy and outrage. The problem was that it was demonstrably false. Palace records showed that when Meghan had requested mental health support in early 2020, she'd been provided with three options: a private psychiatrist who regularly worked with royal family members, a therapist specializing in postpartum mental health, and access to a residential treatment facility if needed. Meghan had rejected all three according to contemporaneous documentation because she wanted to choose her own therapist in the United States and wanted the palace to pay for it while not being informed of the treatment details. The palace had explained that for security and insurance reasons, they needed some oversight of any treatment providers, standard protocol for all senior royals. Meghan had characterized this as being denied help. When this interview was published, Charles had been at Sandringham, already dealing with Andrew's crisis. He'd read the article in his study, and those present reported that he'd gone absolutely still, the kind of controlled fury that was more frightening than any outburst. "This is unconscionable," he'd said quietly. "She's not just distorting what happened. She's making claims that could have been easily prevented from seeking help when documentation proves we did everything we could to facilitate it." That evening, Charles had called William and Anne to Sandringham for an emergency meeting. The three of them, along with Camilla, had spent hours reviewing not just this latest incident, but the entire pattern of behavior over the past 9 months. By the end of the meeting, Charles had made his decision. The private approaches had failed. The boundaries he'd tried to establish had been ignored. And the latest claim, so serious and so demonstrably false, had created an obligation to act. Not out of vindictiveness, but out of institutional necessity. The monarchy could not function if former members were allowed to make unchallenged claims that damaged its credibility while profiting from their association with it. The decision to take formal action had been made that night. The following weeks were spent on legal review, drafting appropriate language, and ensuring every measure taken could be defended both legally and morally. And on December 3rd, the statement was released, marking the point of no return in the relationship between King Charles and his daughter-in-law. The palace deliberations. The meetings that led to King Charles's unprecedented action took place across several tense sessions in late November, each one pushing the palace closer to a decision that everyone understood would be irreversible. The deliberations revealed not just strategic calculations, but fundamental philosophical divisions about what the monarchy owed to family members who'd chosen to leave it. The first formal meeting occurred on November 24th at Buckingham Palace, in a secure room typically reserved for discussions of national security matters. Present were King Charles, Prince William, Princess Anne, Queen Camilla, and 3 senior advisors: the palace's head of legal affairs, the communications director, and the private secretary. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of what was being contemplated. Charles opened by laying out the situation as he understood it. Over the past 9 months, the Duchess of Sussex has made 47 public statements about her time in the royal family. Our records indicate that 32 of these statements contradict documented evidence. We have attempted private resolution repeatedly. Those attempts have been rejected. The question before us is whether we have reached a point where institutional protection requires formal action. William spoke next, his presentation methodical and unemotional. He'd prepared a detailed analysis showing not just individual false claims but patterns in their deployment. Controversial statements tended to emerge when Sussex commercial ventures needed publicity. Claims about institutional cruelty intensified when their media profile needed boosting. The timing, William argued, suggested calculation rather than spontaneous truth-telling. "I'm not questioning that Meghan felt isolated or unsupported," William said carefully. "Feelings are subjective, but feelings don't give license to make factual claims that are demonstrably false. When she says we denied her mental health support, that's not a feeling, it's an accusation. And it's an accusation our records prove is untrue." Anne's position was characteristically direct. The institution has survived for over 1,000 years because it maintains discipline and boundaries. When those boundaries are violated without consequence, precedent is established. If we allow one former member to profit from false claims without response, we invite others to do the same. This isn't about Meghan specifically. This is about what we're willing to tolerate from anyone. But it was Camilla who articulated the emotional complexity that Charles was struggling with. She'd been quiet through most of the discussion, but when she finally spoke, her words carried weight. "I understand the impulse toward mercy," she said, looking at Charles. "You're his father. You don't want to be the king who formally acts against his son's wife. But mercy without accountability isn't actually mercy, it's enabling. And what's being enabled here is systematic distortion that damages not just the institution but truth itself." The legal advisor weighed in with practical considerations. "Any action we take must be defensible legally and morally. We can withdraw courtesies that were extended as privileges, not rights. We can establish protocols for correcting false statements, provided we can document their falsity. What we cannot do is punish them for leaving or silence them entirely. The line we must walk is narrow but clear." Charles wrestled visibly with the decision. At several points during the meeting, he raised objections to his own advisor's recommendations. Isn't there a way to address this without formal action? Can we not simply issue corrections without withdrawing privileges? Each time, his advisors walked him through why half measures wouldn't work. The Sussexes had shown no inclination to modify behavior in response to private pressure. Corrections without consequences would be ignored just as previous private approaches had been. The meeting adjourned without final decision but with an assignment. The legal team would draft possible actions, ranging from minimal response to comprehensive measures. These would be reviewed at a second meeting in 3 days. That second meeting on November 27th was even more tense. The legal team had prepared 3 options. Option 1 was a simple public statement correcting the most egregious false claims without imposing consequences. Option 2 was formal correction protocol plus withdrawal of some courtesies. Option 3 was comprehensive action including title restrictions, privilege withdrawals, and establishment of ongoing correction mechanisms. William argued for Option 3. Half measures will be interpreted as weakness and ignored. If we're going to act, we need to act decisively enough that behavior actually changes. Anne agreed immediately. Anything less than Option 3 is a performative gesture that solves nothing. Charles remained conflicted. Option 3 feels punitive. It feels like we're punishing them for speaking their truth. William's response was sharp. "They're not speaking their truth, Father. They're speaking demonstrable falsehoods. There's a difference. And if we don't establish that difference clearly, we're complicit in the distortion." The meeting became heated at points, particularly when discussing how Harry would react. Charles feared this would permanently sever his relationship with his younger son. William argued the relationship was already severed by Harry's refusal to acknowledge reality. The question wasn't whether the relationship would survive, it was whether the monarchy would. Camilla again provided the perspective that finally moved Charles toward decision. She described her own experience being publicly vilified for years, how painful it had been, how tempting it was to fight back or seek sympathy through selective truth-telling. "But I didn't," she said quietly, "because I understood that being part of this institution, even tangentially, meant accepting certain disciplines. Meghan hasn't accepted those disciplines. She's rejected them explicitly. And if she's going to reject the responsibilities while exploiting the associations, there must be consequences." The third and final meeting occurred on November 30th, after the mental health treatment claim had been published. Charles had spent the intervening days reviewing documents, reading legal analyses, and apparently wrestling with his conscience. But when he entered the meeting, his decision was made. "We proceed with Option 3, he said without preamble. "Every measure must be legally sound, morally defensible, and clearly communicated. This is not punishment. This is boundary enforcement, and it is unfortunately necessary." His voice carried sadness but also resolution. He'd made peace with what needed to happen, even though it meant acting against his son's wife in ways that would likely cement permanent family estrangement. The room moved immediately into implementation mode. Legal language was finalized, communication strategies were mapped, contingency plans for various Sussex responses were developed, and the date was set. December 3rd, early morning, before the Sussexes could preempt with their own narrative. The palace would act first formally and irreversibly. The action itself. The specific measures outlined in the December 3rd Palace statement were more comprehensive than anyone outside the planning meetings had anticipated. Each element had been carefully considered, legally vetted, and designed to address specific aspects of Sussex behavior that the palace found problematic. The first measure addressed title usage. While Harry and Meghan retained their Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles, they were formally prohibited from using His Royal Highness and Her Royal Highness styling in any commercial, professional, or public capacity. This had technically been agreed upon during their departure negotiations in 2020, but enforcement had been inconsistent. The new directive made clear that any violation would result in formal legal action, not palace statements or private requests, but actual litigation for misrepresentation. The second measure was more subtle but equally significant. Any existing agreements between Sussex commercial entities and third parties that referenced royal connection, used royal imagery, or implied ongoing palace association would be subject to immediate legal review. The palace retained intellectual property rights to certain royal brands, images, and associations. They were now prepared to enforce those rights aggressively against any Sussex venture found to be in violation. The third measure addressed the elephant in the room, conflicting narratives about royal treatment. The palace announced the establishment of a dedicated office responsible for monitoring Sussex public statements and issuing formal corrections when those statements contradicted documented evidence. Importantly, these corrections would include references to contemporaneous records, meeting notes, correspondence, anything that could substantiate the palace's version of events. It was unprecedented transparency, driven by necessity. The fourth measure was personal and painful. Harry and Meghan would no longer have access to royal residences, even for family visits. Previously, they'd been permitted to stay at Frogmore Cottage during UK visits, a courtesy extended to maintain some family connection. That courtesy was now withdrawn. If they visited Britain, they would need to arrange private accommodations. The message was clear. Physical presence within royal properties was a privilege that could be revoked when behavior warranted. The fifth and most controversial measure involved the children. The statement carefully noted that Archie and Lilibet's place in the line of succession was unchanged. This was constitutional and couldn't be altered by palace decree. However, any public use of prince and princess titles for the children in commercial contexts would be treated as the same violation as parental title misuse. The palace was drawing a protective boundary around the children while making clear their titles weren't accessories for brand building. The communication of these measures to Harry and Meghan had been handled through formal legal channels rather than family conversations. Charles had made the difficult decision that this needed to be institutional action, not paternal discipline. A letter from the palace's head of legal affairs had been delivered to Sussex representatives at exactly 6:30 a.m. GMT, 17 minutes before the public statement was released. The timing was calculated to give them notice without allowing time to preempt the palace's announcement. Harry's immediate response, according to sources who saw the correspondence, was fury. His legal team fired back a letter within hours calling the measures vindictive, disproportionate, and potentially actionable. They threatened litigation on multiple grounds, claiming the restrictions violated previous agreements and constituted harassment. The threat was largely bluster. Palace lawyers had been meticulous in ensuring every measure was legally defensible, but it revealed how blindsided the Sussexes felt. Meghan's response was more strategic. Rather than engaging with the specific measures, her team released a statement framing the entire action as further evidence of institutional hostility. "Once again, we see an institution more concerned with control than with compassion," the statement read. "We will not be silenced by legal threats or stripped dignities. Our commitment to speaking truth remains unchanged." The statement carefully avoided addressing whether the truths they'd been speaking were actually accurate. The public statement breakdown revealed just how carefully the palace had crafted their message. Every phrase had been chosen to convey firmness without vindictiveness, authority without cruelty. The repeated use of institutional accuracy rather than lies or false statements maintained decorum while making the point clear. References to documented evidence signaled the palace was prepared to prove their claims, and the overall tone suggested not anger but disappointed necessity, a parent finally setting boundaries after years of trying gentler approaches. International legal experts noted that the palace had created an interesting precedent. By formalizing correction procedures and attaching consequences to title misuse, they'd essentially weaponized transparency. Previous royal scandals had been managed through silence, which allowed speculation to flourish. This approach meant the palace would actively dispute false claims with evidence, potentially exposing more internal workings than they'd traditionally reveal. It was a calculated risk, trading traditional discretion for active defense of institutional credibility. By end of day on December 3rd, the measures were in effect. Legal notices had been served, and the palace had established monitoring systems to track compliance. The Sussexes faced a choice: modify their behavior to comply with the new restrictions, or face the legal and commercial consequences of violation. It was no longer a matter of family dynamics or hurt feelings. It had become a matter of law, contracts, and enforceable boundaries. The palace had transformed a family conflict into an institutional framework, and in doing so, had fundamentally altered the terms of engagement with Harry and Meghan. The aftermath and consequences. The 72 hours following King Charles's action against Meghan's public behavior revealed fault lines that would reshape not just the Sussex relationship with the palace, but the entire conception of what it meant to be royal in the modern era. The international reaction split along predictable but significant lines. British coverage, particularly from outlets that had long criticized Sussex behavior, framed the action as overdue accountability. The Daily Telegraph's headline read, "Monarchy finally enforces standards." The Times ran analysis pieces suggesting this marked a turning point where the institution prioritized credibility over family harmony. Even typically Sussex-sympathetic outlets like The Guardian acknowledged the palace's position had legal merit, whatever one thought of the emotional dimensions. American coverage was far more critical. CNN devoted extensive segments to what they framed as palace attacks on Meghan escalate. MSNBC panels discussed whether this was retaliation for the Sussexes' truth-telling or legitimate institutional protection. The racial dynamics were immediately centered, with multiple commentators questioning whether a white duchess would face such severe measures. Public opinion in the United States tilted heavily toward viewing the action as disproportionate, punitive, and evidence of the institutional hostility Meghan had long described. But the most significant consequences weren't about public opinion. They were commercial and personal. Within 48 hours, two major Sussex brand partnerships announced they were reassessing their relationships in light of recent developments. The language was diplomatic, but the meaning was clear. Companies that had signed deals with Meghan and Harry based partly on royal association were now confronting the reality that the palace was prepared to litigate any use of that association. The legal risk had suddenly become unacceptable. Meghan's lifestyle brand, launched earlier in the year with considerable fanfare, faced immediate complications. Marketing materials that had referenced her unique royal perspective were being reviewed by lawyers. Product packaging that included subtle imagery from her royal years was being assessed for intellectual property violations, and investors who'd backed the brand based on its royal connection were demanding meetings to discuss their exposure. The palace hadn't needed to actively destroy Meghan's commercial ventures. By establishing enforceable boundaries and demonstrating willingness to litigate, they'd made those ventures significantly riskier for everyone involved. Harry's position was perhaps the most devastating. He'd spent years defending Meghan, supporting her narratives, standing by her characterizations of events. But the palace's action, backed by documented evidence, now forced him into an impossible choice. He could continue defending claims that palace records contradicted, making himself look either deluded or dishonest. Or he could acknowledge that some of Meghan's statements had been exaggerated or false, effectively betraying his wife to side with the institution that had driven them out. According to sources close to Harry, he chose a third path, doubling down while refusing to engage with specifics. In private conversations, he reportedly insisted that documented evidence didn't capture emotional truth, that palace records were themselves constructions designed to protect the institution. It was a philosophical argument that allowed him to maintain loyalty to Meghan without directly defending indefensible factual claims. But it also meant accepting that he and his wife would be perpetually at war with his family, with no realistic path toward resolution. The impact on family relationships was immediate and severe. William, who'd been instrumental in pushing for the action, made clear through intermediaries that he considered the matter closed unless the Sussexes modified their behavior. There would be no negotiations, no compromises, no informal workarounds. The boundaries were set, the consequences were established, and compliance was expected. His relationship with Harry, already strained beyond recognition, now existed only in the most formal sense. Anne's reaction was characteristically pragmatic. She viewed the action as necessary institutional maintenance, no more emotionally fraught than any other administrative decision. When asked by a family member how she felt about the permanent rift it might create, she reportedly responded that the rift had been created by Sussex behavior, not by palace response to that behavior. Her position was clear. Institutions that fail to enforce boundaries cease to be institutions. For Camilla, the aftermath brought complicated feelings. She'd supported Charles's decision, had in fact been instrumental in helping him reach it, but she also understood the personal cost he was paying. During a private moment several days after the announcement, Charles had apparently broken down, expressing grief over what felt like losing his son permanently. Camilla had offered comfort, but also reality. You made the only choice available to you. Harry had years to pull Meghan back from this trajectory. He chose not to. That's on him, not you. The consequences for Archie and Lilibet were long-term and tragic. The children, now 4 and 2 respectively, would grow up with their grandfather's action as part of their family history. The palace had been careful to note that their succession position was unchanged, that they remained prince and princess by birthright. But the restrictions on commercial use of those titles meant the children's royal status would be essentially ceremonial, unusable for any practical purpose. They would be royals in name only, growing up in California with no meaningful connection to the institution that defined their lineage. By the end of the first week, a new reality had crystallized. The palace had drawn a line it would not cross back over. The Sussexes had responded by rejecting the line's legitimacy entirely. And the family that had once, however dysfunctionally, been united in protecting the monarchy was now permanently fractured between those inside the institution and those outside it. The question that haunted everyone involved was whether this had been inevitable, whether the trajectory set in motion when Harry and Meghan left in 2020 could ever have ended anywhere other than formal institutional action against them. Charles believed he'd exhausted every alternative. William believed the action should have come sooner. Anne believed it was standard boundary enforcement. And Harry and Meghan believed it was persecution dressed as policy. Perhaps they were all correct. Perhaps this was inevitable, necessary, and tragic all at once. What remained certain was that the action King Charles had taken against Meghan's public behavior had fundamentally altered the terms of what it meant to be royal, what obligations survived departure, and what consequences followed when those obligations were rejected. The monarchy had chosen institutional survival over family unity, and whether that choice would ultimately strengthen or weaken the crown remained to be seen. As the first week of December drew to a close and the initial shock began settling into grim acceptance, the story of King Charles's action against Meghan revealed truths that extended far beyond palace walls or royal dramas. Now, what this moment illuminated was the fundamental tension between individual narrative and institutional reality. Meghan believed she had a right to tell her story, however she remembered it, in whatever terms felt true to her experience. The palace believed that rights came with responsibilities, that freedom to speak didn't include freedom to distort documented facts. Both positions held philosophical merit, but philosophy doesn't resolve conflicts when real-world consequences are at stake. The sadder truth was that this outcome had been years in the making, built through incremental choices on all sides. Each Sussex statement that went unchallenged established precedent for more aggressive claims. Each palace silence was interpreted as either complicity or weakness, and each attempt at private resolution failed because neither side could concede the fundamental point, whether Meghan's truth-telling was liberating honesty or strategic distortion. For families everywhere, royal or otherwise, the lesson is achingly familiar. There comes a point when love isn't enough to bridge the gap between competing realities, when the choice becomes not between right and wrong, but between versions of right that cannot coexist. King Charles made his choice, protecting the institution over protecting his relationship with his son. History will judge whether it was wisdom or tragedy. Perhaps it was both. Thank you for staying with this story. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we can't avoid, only endure.